The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The summary. Type of work, novel. Author, Victor Hugo. Was born in 1802, died in 1885, lived 83 years. Type of plot, historical romance. Time of plot, 15th century. Local, France. First published in 1831, in the first third of the 19th century. Principal characters: Quasimodo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame; Esmeralda, a gypsy dancer; Claude Frollo, Archdiacon of Notre Dame; Phoebus de Chateaupers, Esmeralda's sweetheart; Gringoire, a stupid and poverty-stricken poet. Gringoire. Critique. Victor Hugo, leader of the French Romantic movement, not only could tell a gripping story, but also could endow his essentially romantic characters with a realism as powerful that they have become monumental literary figures. The Hunchback of Notre Dame has every quality of a good novel: an exciting story, a magnificent setting, and deep, lasting characterizations. Perhaps the compelling truth of this novel lies in the idea that God has created in man an imperfect image of himself, an image fettered by society and by man's own body and soul, but one which, in the last analysis, has the freedom to transcend these limitations and achieve spiritual greatness. The story. Louis XI, King of France, was to marry his oldest son to Margaret of Flanders, and in early January 1482, the king was expecting Flemish ambassadors to his court. The great day arrived, coinciding both with Epiphany and the secular celebration of the Festival of Fools. All day long, raucous Parisians had assembled at the great Palace of Justice to see a morality play and to choose a Prince of Fools. The throng was supposed to await the arrival of the Flemish guests, but when the emissaries were late, Gringoire, a penniless and oafish poet, ordered the play to begin. In the middle of the prologue, however, the play came to a standstill as the royal procession passed into the huge palace. After the procession passed, the play was forgotten, and the crowd shouted for the Prince of Fools to be chosen. The Prince of Fools had to be a man of remarkable physical ugliness. One by one, the candidates, eager for this one glory of their disreputable lives, showed their faces in front of a glass window, but the crowd shouted and jeered until a face of such extraordinary hideousness appeared that the people acclaimed this candidate at once as the Prince of Fools. It was Quasimodo, the hunchback bell-ringer of Notre Dame. Nowhere on earth was there a more grotesque creature. One of his eyes was buried under an enormous ven. His teeth hung over his protruding lower lip like tusks. His eyebrows were red bristles, and his gigantic nose curved over his upper lip like a snout. His long arms protruded from his shoulders, dangling like an ape's. Though he was deaf from long years of ringing Notre Dame's thunderous bells, his eyesight was acute. Quasimodo sensed that he had been chosen by popular acclaim, and he was at once proud and suspicious of his honor as he allowed the crowd to dress him in ridiculous robes and hoist him above their heads. From this vantage point he maintained a dignified silence while the parade went through the streets of Paris, stopping only to watch the enchanting dance of a gypsy girl, La Esmeralda, whose grace and charm held her audience spellbound. She had with her a little trained goat that danced to her tambourine. The pair were celebrated throughout Paris, though there were some who thought the girl a witch. So great was her power in captivating her audience. Late that night, the poet Gringoire walked the streets of Paris. He had no shelter, owed money, and was in desperate straits. As the cold night came on, he saw Esmeralda hurrying ahead of him. Then a black hooded man came out of the shadows and seized the gypsy. At the same time, Gringoire caught sight of the hooded man's partner, Quasimodo, who struck Gringoire a terrible blow. The following moment, a horseman came riding from the next street. Catching sight of Esmeralda in the arms of the black-hooded man, the rider demanded that he free the girl or pay with his life. The attackers fled. Esmeralda asked the name of her rescuer. It was Captain Phoebus de Chateauper. From that moment, Esmeralda was hopelessly in love with Phoebus. Gringoire did not bother to discover the plot behind the frustrated kidnapping, but had he known the truth, he might have been more frightened than he was. Quasimodo's hooded companion had been Claude Frollo, Archdeacon of Notre Dame, a man who had once been a pillar of righteousness, but who now, because of loneliness and an insatiable thirst for knowledge and experience, had succumbed to the temptations of necromancy and alchemy. Frollo had befriended Quasimodo when the hunchback had been left at the gates of Notre Dame as an unwanted baby, and to him Quasimodo was slavishly loyal. He acted without question when Frollo asked his aid in kidnapping the beautiful gypsy. Frollo, having admired Esmeralda from a distance, planned to carry her off to his small cell in the cathedral, where he could enjoy her charms at his leisure. As Quasimodo and Frollo hurried back to the cathedral, Gringoire continued on his way and found himself in a disreputable quarter of Paris. Captured by thugs, he was threatened with death if none of the women in the thieves' den would marry him. When no one wanted the pale, thin poet, a noose was lowered about his neck. Suddenly Esmeralda appeared and volunteered to take him. But Gringoire enjoyed no wedding night. Esmeralda's heart belonged to Phoebus. She had rescued the poet only out of pity. In those days, the courts of Paris often picked innocent people from the streets, tried them, and convicted them with little regard for justice. Quasimodo had been seen in his role as the Prince of Fools and had been watched as he stood before the gypsy girl, while she danced. It was rumored that Esmeralda was a witch, and most of Paris suspected that Frollo, Quasimodo's only associate, was a sorcerer. Consequently, Quasimodo was brought into a court, accused of keeping questionable company, and sentenced to a severe flogging and exposure on the pillory. Quasimodo endured his disgrace stoically, but after his mishapen back had been torn by the lash, he was overcome with a terrible thirst. The crowd jeered and threw stones. They hated and feared Quasimodo because of his ugliness. Presently, Esmeralda mounted the scaffold and put her flask to Quasimodo's blackened lips. This act of kindness moved him deeply, and he wept. At that same time, Frollo had happened upon the scene, caught sight of Quasimodo, and departed quickly. Later, Quasimodo was to remember this betrayal. One day, Phoebus was entertaining a lady in a building overlooking the square where Esmeralda was dancing. The gypsy was so smitten with Phoebus that she had taught her goat to spell out his name with alphabet blocks. When she had the animal perform this trick, the lady called her a witch and a sorceress. But Phoebus followed the gypsy and arranged for a rendezvous with her for the following night. Gringoire, meanwhile, happened to meet Frollo, who was jealous of the poet because he was rumored to be Esmeralda's husband. But Gringoire explained that Esmeralda did not love him. She had eyes and heart only for Phoebus. Desperate to preserve Esmeralda for himself, Frollo trailed the young gallant and asked him where he was going. Phoebus said that he had a rendezvous with Esmeralda. The priest offered him money in exchange for an opportunity to conceal himself in the room where this rendezvous was to take place, ostensibly to discover whether Esmeralda were really the girl whose name Phoebus had mentioned. It was a poor ruse at best, but Phoebus was not shy at love-making, and he agreed to the bargain. When he learned that the girl was really Esmeralda, Frollo leaped from concealment and wounded Phoebus with a dagger. Esmeralda could not see her lover's assailant in the darkness, and when she fainted, Frollo escaped. A crowd gathered, murmuring that the sorceress had slain Phoebus. They took the gypsy off to prison. Now tales of Esmeralda's sorcery began to circulate. At her trial, she was convicted of witchcraft, sentenced to do penance on the great porch of Notre Dame, and from there to be taken to a scaffold in the Place de Grève and publicly hanged. Captain Phoebus was not dead, but he had kept silence rather than implicate himself in a case of witchcraft. When Esmeralda was on her way to Notre Dame, she caught sight of him riding on his beautiful horse and called out to him, but he ignored her completely. She then felt that she was doomed. When she came before Frollo to do penance, he offered to save her if she would be his, but she refused. Quasimodo suddenly appeared on the porch, took the girl in his arms, and carried her to sanctuary within the church. Esmeralda was now safe as long as she remained within the cathedral walls. Quasimodo hid her in his own cell, where there was a mattress and water, and brought her food. He kept the cell door locked, so that if her pursuers did break the sanctuary, they could not reach her. Aware that she would be terrified of him if he stayed with her, he entered her cell only to bring her his own dinner. Frollo, knowing that the gypsy was near him in the cathedral, secured a key to the chamber and stole in to see Esmeralda one night. She struggled hopelessly until suddenly Quasimodo entered and dragged the priest from the cell. With smothered rage, he freed the trembling archdeacon and allowed him to run away. One day a mob gathered and demanded that the sorceress be turned from the cathedral. Frollo was jubilant. Quasimodo, however, barred and bolted the great doors. When the crowd charged the cathedral with a battering ram, Quasimodo threw huge stones from a tower where builders had been working. The mob persisting, he poured melted lead upon the crowd below. Then the mob secured ladders and began to mount the facade. But Quasimodo seized the ladders and pushed them from the wall. Hundreds of dead and wounded lay below him. The king's guards joined the fray. Quasimodo, looking down, thought that the soldiers had arrived to protect Esmeralda. He went to her cell, but to his amazement he found the door open and Esmeralda gone. Frollo had given Gringoire the key to her chamber and had led the poet through the cathedral to her cell. Gringoire convinced her that she must fly, since the church was under siege. She followed him trustingly, and he led her to a boat where Frollo was already waiting. Frightened by the violence of the priest, Gringoire fled. Once more, Frollo offered to save Esmeralda if she would be his, but she refused him. Fleeing, she sought refuge in a cell belonging to a mad woman. There the soldiers found her and dragged her away for her execution the next morning at dawn. Quasimodo, meanwhile, roamed the cathedral searching for Esmeralda. Making his way to the tower, which looked down upon the bridge of Notre Dame, Quasimodo came upon Frollo, who stood shaking with laughter as he watched a scene far below. Following the direction of the priest's gaze, Quasimodo saw a gibbet erected in the Place de Grève, and on the platform a woman in white. It was Esmeralda. Quasimodo saw the noose lowered over the girl's head and the platform released. The body swayed in the morning breeze. Then Quasimodo picked up Frollo and thrust him over the wall on which he had been leaning. At that moment Quasimodo understood everything that the priest had done to ensure the death of Esmeralda. He looked at the crushed body at the foot of the tower and then at the figure in white upon the gallows. He wept. After the death of Esmeralda and Claude Frollo, Quasimodo was not to be found. Then, in the reign of Charles VIII, the vault of Montfaucon, in which the bodies of criminals were interred, was opened to locate the remains of a famous prisoner who had been buried there. Among the skeletons were those of a woman who had been clad in white and of a man whose bony arms were wrapped tightly around the woman's body. His spine was crooked, one leg was shorter than the other, and it was evident that he had not been hanged, for his neck was unbroken. When those who discovered these singular remains tried to separate the two bodies, they crumbled into dust.